What a way to kick off our read. Yes, we're reading from Stalin's collected works. It's so good. Such a good version, too. We are down here on Marxism and the National Question, which was written at the end of 2012, the beginning of 2013. We've even got a great big footnote, the Marxist favorite thing. Look at how most of this page is a footnote, chat. Okay, Marxism and the National Question. Giant footnote. Marxism and the National Question was written at the end of 2012, the beginning of 2000, the end of 1912, and the beginning of 1913 in Vienna. It first appeared in the magazine Proshkovnaya, Enlightenment, numbers 3 to 5. 1913 under the title The National Question and Social Democracy, and was signed K. Stalin. In 1914, it was published by the Pryboy Publishers, St. Petersburg, as a separate pamphlet entitled The National Question and Marxism. By order of the Minister of the Interior, the pamphlet was withdrawn from all public libraries and reading rooms. In 1920, the article was republished by the People's Commissariat for Nationalities in a collection of articles by J.V. Stalin on the national question. State Publishing House, Tula. In 1934, the article was included in the book J. Stalin, Marxism and the National and Colonial Question, a collection of articles and speeches. Lenin, in his article, The National Program of the RSDLP, referring to the reasons which were lending prominence to the national question at that period, wrote, quote, "This state of affairs and the principles of the national program of social democracy have already been dealt with recently in theoretical Marxist literature. Prime place must be given here to Stalin's article." Unquote. From February 1913, Lenin wrote to Maxim Gorky, quote, "We have a wonderful Georgian here who has sat down to write a big article for Prechneya after collecting all the Austrian and other material." Unquote. Learning that it was proposed to print the article with the reservation that it was for discussion only, Lenin vigorously objected and wrote, quote, "Of course we are absolutely against this. It is a very good article. The question is a burning issue, and we shall not yield one jot of principle to the Bunda scum." Archives of Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute. Soon after J.V. Stalin's arrest, in March 1913, Lenin wrote to the editors of Social Democrat, quote, "Arrests among us are very heavy. Koba has been taken. Koba managed to write a long article for 3 issues of Proshvenia on the issue of national question. Good! We must fight for the truth and against separatists and opportunists of the Bund and among the liquidators." Archives of the Marx-Lenin Institute. All right, and now we can read it. Marxism and the National Question. The period of counter-revolution in Russia brought not only thunder and lightning in its train, but also disillusionment in the movement and lack of faith in common forces. As long as people believed in a bright future, they fought side by side, irrespective of nationality. Common questions first and foremost. But when doubt crept into people's heart, they began to depart, each to his own national tent. Let every man count only upon himself. The national question, quote unquote, first and foremost. At the same time, a profound upheaval was taking place in the economic life of the country. The year 1905 had not been in vain. One more blow had been struck at the survivals of serfdom in the countryside. The series of good harvests which succeeded the famine years, and the industrial boom which followed, furthered the progress of capitalism. Class differentiation in the countryside, the growth of the towns, the development of trade, and means of communication all took a big stride forward. This applied particularly to the border regions, and it could not but hasten the process of economic consolidation of the nationalities of Russia. They were bound to be stirred into movement. The constitutional regime, established at that time, also acted in the same direction of awakening the nationalities. The spread of newspapers and of literature generally, a certain freedom of the press and cultural institutions, an increase in the number of national theaters, and so forth, all unquestionably helped to strengthen national sentiments. The Duma, with its election campaign and political groups, gave fresh opportunities for greater activities of nations and provided a new wide arena for their mobilization. And the mounting wave of militant nationalism above, and the series of repressive measures taken by the powers that be in vengeance on the border regions for their love of freedom, evoked an answering wave of nationalism below, which at times took the form of crude chauvinism. The spread of Zionism, and this, by the way, keep in mind, this footnote that I'm going to read you here is Comrade Stalin's footnote, right? So, Comrade Stalin puts a footnote here. 2. Zionism, a reactionary nationalist trend of the Jewish bourgeoisie, which had followers among the intellectuals and the more backward sections of the Jewish workers. The Zionists endeavored to isolate the Jewish working class masses from the general struggle of the proletariat. Today, the Zionist organizations are the agents of the American imperialists in their machinations directed against the USSR and the people's democracies, and the revolutionary movement in capitalist and colonial countries. Does that sound like Stalin was a Zionist, chat? Or a pro-Zionist, or whatever the fucking liberals say about him? The spread of Zionism among Jews, the increase of chauvinism in Poland, pan-Islamism among the Tatars, the spread of nationalism among the Armenians, Georgians, and Ukrainians, the general swing of the Philistine towards the anti-Semitism. All these are generally known facts. The wave of nationalism swept onwards with increasing force, threatening to engulf the mass of the workers. And the more the movement for emancipation declined, the more plentifully nationalism pushed forth its blossoms. At this difficult time, social democracy had a high mission: to resist nationalism and to protect the masses from the general epidemic. For social democracy, and social democracy alone, could do this by countering nationalism with the tried weapon of internationalism, with the unity and indivisibility of the class struggle. And the more powerfully the wave of nationalism advanced, the louder had to be the call of social democracy for fraternity and unity among the proletarians of all the nationalities of Russia. And in this connection, particular firmness was demanded of the social democrats of the border regions, who came into direct contact with the nationalist movement. But not all social democrats proved equal to the task. And this applies particularly to the social democrats of the border regions. The Bund, which had previously laid stress on the common task, now began to give prominence to its own specific, purely nationalist aims. It went to the length of declaring observance of the Sabbath and recognition of Yiddish as the fighting issue of its election campaign. See Report of the Ninth Congress of the Bund. The Bund was followed by the Caucasus, one section of the Caucasian Social Democrats, which, like the rest of the Caucasian Social Democrats, had formally rejected cultural national autonomy, are now making it an immediate demand. See announcement of the August conference. This is without mentioning the Conference of the Liquidators, which in a diplomatic way gave its sanction to nationalist facilitations. Again, announcement of the August conference. But from this it follows that the views of Russian social democracy on the national question are not yet clear to all social democrats. It is evident that a serious and comprehensive discussion of the national question is required. Consistent social democrats must work solidly and indefatigably against the fog of nationalism, no matter from what quarter it proceeds. Part 1. The Nation. What is a nation? A nation is primarily a community, a definite community of people. This community is not racial, nor is it tribal. The modern Italian nation was formed from Romans, Teutons, Etruscans, Greeks, Arabs, and so forth. The French nation was formed from the Gauls, Romans, Britons, Teutons, and so on. The same must be said of the British, the Germans, and others, who were formed into nations from people of diverse races and tribes. Thus, a nation is not a racial or tribal, but a historically constituted community of people. On the other hand, it is unquestionable that the great empires of Cyrus and Alexander could not be called nations, although they came to be constituted historically and were formed out of different tribes and races. They were not nations, but casually and loosely connected conglomerates of groups which fell apart or joined together according to the victories or defeats of this or that conqueror. Thus, a nation is not a casual or inferior conglomeration, but a stable community of people. This is, by the way, why the USA could rightfully be argued as not being a nation. A country? A nation? No. But not every stable community constitutes a nation. Austria and Russia are also stable communities, but nobody calls them nations. What distinguishes a national community from a state community? The fact, among others, that a national community is inconceivable without a common language, while a state need not have a common language. The Czech nation in Austria and the Polish in Russia would be impossible if each did not have a common language, whereas the integrity of Russia and Austria is not affected by the fact that there are a number of different languages within their borders. We are referring, of course, to the spoken languages of the people, and not to the official governmental language. Thus, a common language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. So let me ask you this now. Is there a common language in the USA or Canada? Again, we're not referring to the governmental language. Thus, a common language is one of the characteristic features of a nation. Yeah, no, of course not, because First Nations are in USA, are they not? They have USA citizenships. And you have you have nations that speak Dene, nations that speak Lakota, right? Cree, hundreds of languages. This, of course, does not mean that different nations always and everywhere speak different languages, or that all who speak one language necessarily constitute one nation. A common language for every nation, but not necessarily different languages for different nations. There is no nation which at one and the same time speaks several languages, but this does not mean that there cannot be two nations speaking the same language. Englishmen and Americans speak one language, but they do not constitute one nation. The same is true of the Norwegians and the Danes, the English and the Irish. And this is why, by the way, Harry Haywood's idea of like the emerging national consciousnesses that might happen in the case of a US, like a revolution in the Americas, is very interesting to think about. Because with the struggle for the liberation, I've talked about this all the time, with the struggle for the liberation of the First Nations and of the internal colony, the internally oppressed nation of Black people, in the struggle for that as well, the people, the settlers who currently are all allied around the idea of whiteness will also have new communities that emerge. In many cases, like the prototype of that already exists. But why, for instance, do the English and Americans not constitute one nation, in spite of their common language? Firstly, because they do not live together, but inhabit different territories. A nation is formed only as a result of lengthy and systematic intercourse, as a result of people living together generation after generation. But people cannot live together for lengthy periods unless they have a common territory. Englishmen and Americans originally inhabited the same territory, England, and constituted one nation. Later, one section of the English immigrated to England, to a new territory, America. And there, this is where I disagree with this part, and there, in the new territory, in the course of time, came to form the new American nation. Difference of territory led to the formation of different nations. And that's where I see that's where I would disagree, because America isn't one nation, America is many nations. And like I say, through the course of the resistance against the empire and the colonies that exist here, new cultural and community national consciousnesses will emerge. Like a maritime consciousness, for example. Right? To give you an example. And these will exist in the same geospatial locations and will be getting along with like the First Nations and the formerly oppressed people who live there. Because we will have measures that ensure that that the formerly oppressed people have equal political right and say over their rightful territories in a way that they, of course, don't now. Up to and including the right to succession. But again, this is all something that we have to work out through the course of democratic revolution, which the idea in Canada and perhaps the US, I do like the idea of a House of Nations replacing the House of Senate as a step towards that. So I agree with what he's saying here about common territory is one of the characteristic features of a nation. I just disagree that America is one nation. I think that within the Americas, even amongst the settlers, you have many nations and like many different cultural, like I use candlepin bowling as my example, right? If you look at candlepin bowling, 10 pin candlepin bowling, that's played in like Maine and Nova Scotia and a little like and New Brunswick, right? And that's it. Like that type of bowling isn't played anywhere else other than this location because this community of people in this geospatial location, yeah, New Hampshire, but you know what I mean? It's the people in this geospatial location. You can see how this Cosmopolitics, welcome in. Everybody follow my comrade. You can see how this has emerged from people living in this geospatial location, right? That's a genuine type of culture, whereas the US quote unquote culture is something that is forced from above that basically is completely cosmopolitanism. Which is why, again, I really like Harry Haywood's work on talking about the possible nations that would emerge through the course of revolution. And it's not a perfect work, again, but it does get you thinking. Because we have to remember that you look at what was here before, and then you have to remember that we need land back, but at the same time that we have land back, we can't go backwards. And people here need liberation that did not exist here before colonization. And that's vital. Because we all need to be free, right? It's part of that same struggle, which is against imperialism, colonialism, and private property. So, sorry for that sidetrack. That's the one note I have on when he says about America. Thus, a common territory is one of the characteristic features of a nation. But this is not all. Common territory does not by itself create a nation. This requires, in addition, an eternal economic bond to weld the various parts of the nation into a single whole. There is no such bond between England and America. And so they constitute two different nations. But the Americans themselves would not deserve to be called a nation, were it not the different parts of America bound together into an economic whole, as a result of the division of labor between them, the development of the means of communication, and so forth. Take the Georgians, for instance. The Georgians, before the reform, inhabited a common territory and spoke one language. Nevertheless, they did not, strictly speaking, constitute one nation. For being split up into a number of disconnected principalities, they could not share a common economic life. For centuries, they waged war against each other and pillaged each other, each inciting the Persians and Turks against each other. The ephemeral and casual union of the principalities, which some successful king sometimes managed to bring about, embraced at best a superficial administrative sphere, and rapidly disintegrated owing to the caprices of the princes and the indifference of the peasants. Nor could it be otherwise in economically disunited Georgia. Georgia came on the scene as a nation only in the latter half of the 19th century, when the fall of serfdom and the growth of the economic life of the country and the development of the means of communication and the rise of capitalism introduced division of labor between the various districts of Georgia, completely shattered the economic isolation of the principalities, and bound them together into a single whole. The same must be said of other nations, which have passed through the stage of feudalism and have developed capitalism. Thus, a common economic life, economic cohesion, is one of the characteristic features of a nation. But even this is not all. Apart from the foregoing, one must take into consideration the specific spiritual complexion of the people constituting a nation. Nations differ not only in their conditions of life, but also in their spiritual complexion, which manifests itself in peculiarities of the national culture. If England, America, and Ireland, which speak one language, nevertheless constitute three distinct nations, it is in no small measure due to the peculiar psychological makeup, which they developed from generation to generation as a result of dissimilar conditions of existence. Of course, by itself, psychological makeup, or as it is otherwise called, national character, is something intangible for the observer. But insofar as it manifests itself in a distinctive culture, common to the nation, it is something tangible and cannot be ignored. Needless to say, national character is not a thing that is fixed once and for all, but is modified by changes in the conditions of life. But since it exists at every given moment, it leaves its impress on the physiognomy of the nation. Thus, a common psychological makeup, which manifests itself in a common culture, is one of the characteristic features of a nation. We have now exhausted the characteristic features of a nation. A nation is a historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. Which is why, again, I push back against his idea that America would constitute a nation. I don't think it fits all of these criteria. Although nations will emerge through the course of revolution within America. And America will instead, like, because to me, America in many ways is like is a prison house of nations, but in a different way than Russia is. Right? America is a prison house of nations, but we can't think of that as the US in isolation. We can't think of that as we can't think of that as US in isolation or Canada in isolation. When I say America is a prison house of nations, I'm talking about America from North America all the way to the south. And that's why I say it differs in the sense that a free America will be made up of all kinds of different nations, right? There won't be one American nation. Does that make sense? There will be the goal, and I think ultimately revolution will lead to one American country, and that country will span all of America, north and south. But I think America will always be a multinational union, right? It has a possibility to be a single country, but not the possibility to be a single nation. Does that make sense? Fidel spoke about this in 1991. Yes, exactly. The criteria America exhibits are forced. They aren't fundamental characteristics of internal people. Yeah. And I mean, and even still, like taking this, it doesn't fit all these criteria. Yeah, let's start with the North American Socialist Republics and take it from there. And we want to join up, Chimera, with the Union of the South American Socialist Republics, right? But again, we're talking about the long course of development here. The very broad, long, and it's up to the people, including the people of the hundreds of nations involved in this struggle, to understand that. The details of how to get there. Our job is to put the power in their hands so that can be accomplished. It goes without saying that a nation, like every historical phenomenon, is subject to the law of change, has its history, its beginning and end. Cuba, that has to happen, Chimera. Cuba, the future capital of the American country, of the American socialist country. It must be emphasized that none of the above characteristics, taken separately, is sufficient to define a nation. More than that, it is sufficient for a single one of these characteristics to be lacking, and the nation ceases to be a nation. It is possible to conceive of people possessing a common national character who, nevertheless, cannot be said to constitute a single nation if they are economically disunited, inhabit different territories, speak different languages, and so forth. So you see why I leave out the America in that definition then. Such, for instance, are the Russian, Galician, Georgian, and Caucasian Highland Jews, who, in our opinion, do not constitute a single nation. Aha! Oh! Okay, so you understand what he's saying there, right? Or what this is really speaking against specifically? This specific paragraph here is against Zionism. Again. And this was published what? This was published, what did they say, 1912, 1913? And this is already talking against like the concept of Zionism right here. It is possible to conceive of people possessing a common national character who nevertheless cannot be said to constitute a single nation if they are economically disunited, inhabit different territories, speak different languages, and so forth. Such, for instance, are the Russian, Galician, American, Georgian, and Caucasian Highland Jews, who, in our opinion, do not constitute a single nation. It is possible to conceive of people with a common territory and economic life who, nevertheless, would not constitute a single nation because they have no common language and no common national character. Such, for instance, are the Germans and Letts in the Baltic region. And I would argue this is the primary things that makes America not a nation, is the language problem. It is not actually a nation of a common language. Even the settlers that were brought in, that always had been a problem for the state and the power that be. Finally, the Norwegians and Danes speak one language, but they do not constitute a single nation, owing to the absence of the other characteristics. It is only when all these characteristics are present together that we have a nation. It might appear that national character is not one of the characteristics, but the sole essential characteristic of a nation. And that all the other characteristics are, properly speaking, only conditions of the development of a nation, rather than its characteristics. Such, for instance, is the view held by R. Springer, and more particularly by O. Brouwer, who are social democratic theoreticians on the national question, well known in Austria. Let us examine their theory of the nation. According to Springer, quote, a nation is a union of similarly thinking and similarly speaking persons. It is a cultural community of modern people no longer tied to the soil. Unquote. See R. Springer, The National Problem. Oczniensia Polosa Publishing House, 1909. So you see how far ahead of his time Stalin was, right? Thus, a union of similarly thinking and similarly speaking people, no matter how disconnected they may be, no matter where they live, is a nation. Bauer goes even further. What is a nation? He asks. Is it a common language which makes people a nation? But the English and the Irish speak the same language without, however, being one people. The Jews have no common language and yet are a nation. See O. Brouwer, The National Question and Social Democracy, CERT Publishing House, 1909. What, then, is a nation? A nation is a relative community of character. Same person, same book. But what is character? In this case, national character. National character is, quote, the sum total of characteristics which distinguish the people of one nationality from the people of another nationality. The complex of physical and spiritual characteristics which distinguish one nation from another. Again, O. Brouwer. Bauer knows, of course, that national character does not drop from the skies. And he therefore adds, quote, the character of people is determined by nothing so much as by their destiny. A nation is nothing but a community with a common destiny, which in turn is determined by the conditions under which people produce their means of subsistence and distribute the products of their labor. Unquote. We thus arrive at the most complete, as Bauer calls it, definition of a nation. Quote, a nation is an aggregate of people bound in a community of character by a common destiny. Bauer again. We thus have a common national character based on a common destiny, but not necessarily connected with a common territory, language, or economic life. But what in that case remains of the nation? What common nationality can there be among people who are economically disconnected, inhabit different territories, and from generation to generation speak different languages? Again, America. Bauer speaks of the Jews as a nation, although they, quote, have no common language. But what common destiny and national cohesion is there, for instance, between the Georgian, Daghestanian, Russian, and American Jews, who are completely separated from one another, inhabit different territories, and speak different languages? The above mentioned Jews undoubtedly lead their economic and political life in common with the Georgians, Daghestanians, Russians, and Americans, respectively. And they live in the same cultural atmosphere as these. This is bound to leave a definite impression on their national character. If there is anything common to them left, it is their religion, their common origin, and certain relics of the national character. All this is beyond question. But how can it be seriously maintained that purified religious rites and fading psychological relics affect the destiny of these Jews more powerfully than the living social, economic, and cultural environment that surrounds them? And it is only on this assumption that it is possible to speak of the Jews as a single nation at all. What then distinguishes Bauer's nation from the mystical and self-sufficient national spirit of the spiritualists? Bauer sets up an impassable barrier between the distinctive feature of the nation, national character, and the conditions of their life, divorcing the one from the other. But what is national character, if not a reflection of the conditions of life? A coagulation of impressions derived from the environment? How can one limit the matter of national character alone, isolating and divorcing it from the soil that gave rise to it? Further, what indeed distinguished the English nation from the American nation at the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th centuries, when America was still known as New England? Not national character, of course, for the Americans had originated from England and had brought with them to America not only the English language, but also the English national character, which of course they could not lose so soon. Although, under the influence of the new conditions, they would naturally be developing their own specific character. Yet, despite the more or less common character, they at that time already constituted a nation distinct from England. Obviously, New England as a nation differed then from England as a nation, not by its specific national character, or not so much by its national character as by its environment and conditions of life, which were distinct from those of England. It is therefore clear that there is in fact no single distinguishing characteristic of a nation. There is only a sum total of characteristics of which, when nations are compared, sometimes one characteristic, national character, sometimes another, language, or sometimes a third, territory, economic conditions, stands out in sharper relief. A nation constitutes the combination of all these characteristics taken together. Bauer's point of view, which identifies a nation with its national character, divorces the nation from its soil and converts it into an invisible, self contained force. The result is not a living, active nation, but something mystical, intangible, and supernatural. For, I repeat, what sort of nation, for instance, is a Jewish nation, which consists of Georgian, Daghestanian, Russian, American, and other Jews, the members of which do not understand each other, since they speak different languages, inhabit different parts of the globe, will never see each other, and will never act together, whether in time of peace or in time of war. No, it is not for such paper nations that social democracy draws up its national program. It can reckon only with real nations, which act and move, and therefore insist on being reckoned with. Bauer is obviously confusing nation, which is a historical category, with tribe, which is an ethno-geographical category. However, Bauer himself apparently feels the weakness of his position. While at the beginning of his book, he definitely declares the Jews to be a nation, he corrects himself at the end of the book and states that, quote, in general, capitalist society makes it impossible for them, the Jews, to constitute a nation, by causing them to assimilate with other nations. The reason it appears is that, quote, the Jews have no closed territory of settlement, whereas the Czechs, for instance, have such a territory, and according to Bauer, will survive as a nation. In short, the reason lies in the absence of territory. What does it sound like Bauer's arguing towards? By arguing thus, Bauer wanted to prove that the Jewish workers cannot demand national autonomy, but he thereby inadvertently refuted his own theory, which denies that a common territory is one of the characteristics of a nation. But Bauer goes further. In the beginning of the book, he definitely declares that, quote, the Jews have no common language and yet are a nation. But hardly has he reached page 130, then he effects a change of the front, and just as definitely declares that, quote, unquestionably, no nation is possible without a common language, our italics. Bauer wanted to prove that language is one of the most important instruments of human intercourse. But at the same time, he inadvertently proved something he did not mean to prove. Namely, the unsoundness of his own theory on nations, which denies the significance of a common language. Thus, this theory, stitched together by idealistic threads, it refutes itself. How are we feeling, chat? Makes sense? Are we all following along? W's in chat if part 1, what defines a nation, made sense to you. Or let me know any concerns or questions you have. Don't be scared of interrupting as I continue to read on. Part 2, the national movement. A nation is not merely a historical category, but a historical category belonging to a definite epoch, the epoch of rising capitalism, the process of the elimination of feudalism, and the development of capitalism, is at the same time a process of the constitution of people into nations. Such, for instance, was the case in Western Europe. And this again is where I slightly break with Stalin and I say if you want an updated analysis of the historical origin of nation, I would suggest you listen to my read of Kim Jong Il's on a correct understanding of nationalism. Which indigenous nations have been artificially split in Canada or America? Well, I mean, like the Mi'kmaq Nation is over borders. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy is split across the borders. So the Mohawk Nation and several others in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a bunch of others, a lot of others. And then south of the border, there's a lot too, right? Such, for instance, so yeah, this is the one part I would because we do have nations that emerged not in the contest against feudalism. But for that updated historical analysis, check out my reading of Kim Jong Il on having a correct understanding of nationalism, which is what I would read after this. The British, French, Germans, Italians, and others were formed into nation at the time of the victorious advance of capitalism and its triumph over feudal disunity. And yes, that is the case, of course, in Europe. Of course, let's remember that nations emerged elsewhere too, not in the context, not in the contest against feudalism, but for another reason, for the management of territory and the interrelation of other nations. And that happened in the Americas before colonization. That's what I'm saying. Yes, Sam gets it. Which again is down to the language problem in the Americas, in my opinion, which I believe Fidel said similar things about. But the formation of nations in those instances, at the same time, signified their conversion into independent national states. The British, French, and other nations are at the same time British, etc. states. Ireland, which did not participate in this process, does not alter the general picture. Matters proceed somewhat differently in Eastern Europe. Whereas in much in the West, nations developed into states, in the East, multinational states were formed, states consisting of several nationalities. Such are Austria Hungary and Russia. In Austria, the Germans proved to be politically the most developed, and they took it upon themselves to unite the Austrian nationalities into a state. In Hungary, the most adapted for state organization were the Magyars, the core of the Hungarian nationalities, and it was they who united Hungary. In Russia, the uniting of the nationalities was undertaken by the Great Russians, who were headed historically formed, powerful, and well organized aristocratic military bureaucracy. That is how matters proceeded in the East. Before I continue on, I just want to say we got an ad break coming right up. If you like what you see here, consider supporting our stream with subs, gift subs, biddies, your prime subbies. Those tier 3 subs go give you the most contribution to the Larry stream and give you some special perks for using the emotes. Think about a tier 3 subby today if you can afford it. If you can't afford to contribute, please do not. Otherwise, I appreciate everybody sitting through the ads, and I will see you when the ads are over. And don't worry, anybody who's been interrupted by ads, I do upload all of these reads to my YouTube as well. This special method of formation of states could take place only where feudalism had not yet been eliminated, where capitalism was feebly developed, where the nationalities which had been forced into the background had not yet been able to consolidate themselves economically into integral nations. But capitalism also began to develop in the eastern states. Trade and the means of communication were developing. Larger towns were springing up. The nations were becoming economically consolidated. Capitalism, Erupting into tranquil life of the nationalities, which had been pushed into the background, was arousing them and stirring them into action. The development of the press and the theater, the activity of the Richtstraat in Austria and the Duma in Russia were helping to strengthen national sentiments. The intelligentsia that had risen was being endued with the national idea and was acting in the same direction. But the nations which had been pushed into the background and had now awakened to independent life could no longer form themselves into independent national states. They encountered on their path the very powerful resistance of the ruling strata of the dominant nations, which had long ago assumed the control of the state. They were too late. In this way, the Czechs, Poles, etc., formed themselves into nations. In Austria, the Croats, etc. In Hungary, the Lets, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, etc. in Russia. What had been an exception in Western Europe, Ireland, became the rule in the East. In the West, Ireland responded to its exceptional position by national movement. In the East, the awakened nations were bound to responding in the same fashion. Thus arose the circumstances which impelled the young nations of Eastern Europe on the path of struggle. The struggle began and flared up, to be sure, not between nations as a whole, but between the ruling classes of the dominant nations and of those they had pushed into the background. The struggle is usually conducted by the urban petty bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation against the big bourgeoisie of the dominant nation, Czechs and Germans, or by the rural bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation against the landlords of the dominant nation, as the Ukrainians in Poland, or by the whole national bourgeoisie of the oppressed nations against the ruling nobility of the dominant nation, such as Poland, Lithuania, and the Ukraine in Russia. The bourgeoisie plays the leading role. The chief problem for the young bourgeoisie is the problem of the market. Its aim is to sell its goods and to emerge victorious from competition with the bourgeoisie of a different nationality. Hence, its desires to secure its home market. The market is the first school in which the bourgeoisie learns its nationalism. But matters are usually not confined to the market. The semi-feudal, semi-bourgeois bureaucracy of the dominant nation intervenes in the struggle with its own methods of arresting and preventing. The bourgeoisie, whether the big or small, of the dominant nation, is able to deal more swiftly and decisively with its competitor. Forces are united, and a series of restrictive measures is put into operation against the alien bourgeoisie, measures passing into acts of repression. The struggle spreads from the economic sphere to the political sphere. Restriction of freedom of movement, repression of language, restriction of franchise, closing of schools, religious restrictions, and so on are piled upon the heads of the competitor. Of course, such measures are designed not only in the interest of the bourgeois classes of the dominant nation, but also in furtherance of the specifically cast aims, so to speak, of the ruling bureaucracy. But from the point of view of the results achieved, this is quite immaterial. The bourgeois classes and the bureaucracy in this matter go hand in hand, whether it be in Austria-Hungary or in Russia. The bourgeoisie of the oppressed nation, repressed on every hand, is naturally stirred into movement. It appeals to its native folk and begins to shout about the fatherland, claiming that its own cause is the cause of the nation as a whole. It recruits itself an army from among its countrymen in the interest of the fatherland. Nor do the folk always remain unresponsive to its appeals. They rally around its banner. The repression from above affects them too and provokes their discontent. Thus, the national movement begins. The strength The strength of the national movement is determined by the degree to which the wide strata of the nation, the proletariat, and the peasantry participate in it. Whether the proletariat rallies to the banner of the bourgeois nationalism depends on the degree of development of class antagonisms, on the class consciousness and degree of the organization of the proletariat. The class conscious proletariat has its own tried banner and has no need to rally to the banner of the bourgeoisie. As far as the peasants are concerned, their participation in the national movement depends primarily on the character of the repressions. If the repressions affect the land, as was the case in Ireland, then the mass of the peasants immediately rally to the banner of the national movement. On the other hand, if, for example, there is no serious anti-Russian nationalism in Georgia, it is primarily because there are neither Russian landlords nor a Russian big bourgeoisie there to supply the fuel for such nationalism among the masses. In Georgia, there is anti-Armenian nationalism. But this is because there is still an Armenian big bourgeoisie there, which, by getting the better of the small and still unconsolidated Georgian bourgeoisie, drives the latter to anti-Armenian nationalism. Depending on these factors, the national movement either assumes a mass character and steadily grows, as in Ireland and Galicia, or is converted into a series of petty collisions, degenerating into squabbles and fights over signboards, as in some small towns of Bohemia. The content of the national movement, of course, cannot everywhere be the same. It is wholly determined by the diverse demands made by the movement. In Ireland, the movement bears an agrarian character. In Bohemia, it bears a language character. In one place, the demand is for civil equality and religious freedom. In another, for the nation's own officials or its own diet. The diversity of demands not infrequently reveals the diverse features which characterize a nation in general: language, territory, etc. It is worthy of note that we never meet the demand based on Bauer's all-embracing national character. And this is natural. National character, in itself, is something intangible, and is absolutely correctly remarked by J. Strasser, a politician can't do anything with it. See Der Arbeiter et die Nation, 1912. Such, in general, are the forms and character of the national movement. From what has been said, it will be clear that the national struggle, under the conditions of rising capitalism, is a struggle of the bourgeois classes among themselves. Sometimes the bourgeoisie succeeds in drawing the proletariat into the national movement, and then the national struggle externally assumes a nationwide character. But this is only externally. In its essence, it is always a bourgeois struggle, one that is to the advantage and profit, mainly, of the bourgeoisie. This point, however, I'm going to make note of that you will see is not only does Kim Jong-il push back against this idea that the nation is always at once a bourgeois struggle, but so does Stalin. And we're going to see that right after we're done reading this, okay? That doesn't mean that everything in this is wrong, but that particular point has a historical limitation. And that historical limitation is the current position of the bourgeoisie in its fight against, or the current position of the proletariat, I should say, in its fight against the bourgeoisie. But it does not by any means follow that the proletariat should not put up a fight against the policy of national oppression. Restriction of freedom of movement, disenfranchisement, repression of language, closing of schools, and other forms of persecution affect the workers no less, if not more, than the bourgeoisie. Such a state of affairs can only serve to retard the free development of the intellectual forces of the proletariat of subject nations. One cannot speak seriously of a full development of the intellectual faculties of the Tartar or the Jewish worker if he is not allowed to use his native language at meetings and lectures, and if his schools are closed down. But the policy of nationalist persecution is dangerous to the cause of the proletariat also on another account. It diverts the attention of large strata from the social questions, questions of the class struggle, to national questions, questions common to the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And this creates a favorable soil for lying propaganda about harmony of interests, for glossing over the class interests of the proletariat, and for the intellectual enslavement of the workers. This creates a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all nationalities. If a considerable proportion of Polish workers are still in intellectual bondage to the bourgeois nationalists, if they still stand aloof from the international labor movement, it is chiefly because of the age-old anti-Polish policy of the powers that be, creates the soil for this bondage and hinders the emancipation of the workers from it. But the policy of persecution does not stop there. It is not infrequently passes from a system of oppression to a system of inciting nations against each other, to a system of massacres and pogroms. Of course, the latter system is not everywhere and always possible, but where it is possible, in the absence of elementary civil rights, it frequently assumes horrifying proportions and threatens to drown the cause of unity of the workers in blood and tears. The Caucasus and South Russia furnish numerous examples. Divide and rule, such is the purpose of the policy of incitement. And where such a policy succeeds, it is tremendous evil for the proletariat and a serious obstacle to the cause of uniting the workers of all the nationalities in the state. But the workers are interested in the complete amalgamation of all their fellow workers in a single international army, in their speedy and final emancipation from the intellectual bondage of the bourgeoisie, and in the full and free development of the intellectual forces of their brothers, whatever nation they may belong to. The workers, therefore, combat and will continue to combat policy of national oppression in all its forms, from the most subtle to the most crude, as well as the policy of inciting nations against each other in all forms. Social democracy in all countries, therefore, proclaims the right of nations to self-determination. The right of self-determination means that only the nation itself has the right to determine its destiny, and that no one has the right to forcibly interfere in the life of the nation, to destroy its schools and other institutions, to violate its habits and its customs, to repress its language or curtail its rights. This, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every custom and institution of a nation. While combating the coercion of any nation, it will uphold only the right of the nation itself to determine its own destiny, at the same time agitating against harmful customs and institutions of that nation in order to enable the toiling strata of the nation to emancipate themselves from them. The right to self-determination means that a nation may arrange its life in any way it wishes. It has the right to arrange its life on the basis of autonomy. It has the right to enter into federal relations with other nations. It has the right to complete succession. Nations are sovereign, and all nations have equal rights. This, of course, does not mean that social democracy will support every demand of a nation. A nation has the right even to return to the old order of things. But this does not mean that social democracy will subscribe to such a decision, if taken by some institution of a particular nation. The obligations of social democracy, which defends the interests of the proletariat and the rights of a nation, consists of the various classes, are two different things. In fighting for the right of nations to self-determination, The aim of social democracy is to put an end to the policy of national oppression, to render it impossible, and thereby to remove the grounds of strife between nations, to take the edge off that strife and reduce it to a minimum. This is what essentially distinguishes the policy of class-conscious proletariat from the policy of the bourgeoisie, which attempts to aggravate and fan the national struggle and to prolong and sharpen the national movement. And that is why the class-conscious proletariat cannot rally under the national flag of the bourgeoisie. That is why the so-called evolutionary national policy advocated by Bauer cannot become the policy of the proletariat. Bauer's attempts to identify his evolutionary national policy with the policy of the modern working class is an attempt to adapt the class struggle of the workers to the struggle of the nations. The fate of a national movement, which is essentially a bourgeois movement, is naturally bound up with the fate of the bourgeoisie. This final disappearance of a national movement is possible only with the downfall of the bourgeoisie. Only under the reign of socialism can peace be fully established. But even within the framework of capitalism, it is possible to reduce national struggle to a minimum, to undermine it at the root, to render it as harmless as possible to the proletariat. This is borne out, for example, by Switzerland and America. It requires that the country should be democratized and nations being the opportunity of free development. Now, before we do this next part here, this last part, I just want to see. Okay, we're gonna break this work up here, actually. Because there is also part 4 after this. So we've done part 1 and 2, and then next time we'll do part 3. We'll do more parts next time because there is a lot more to this work. However, one reason I want to break it up here, in particular, before we read part 3 next week, is because I want to look right now at Stalin's last speech that he ever gave. If you remember, if you were just listening, you might remember I just mentioned that that not only did Kim Jong-il kind of update the analysis or the idea that the national struggle is inherently a bourgeois struggle, Stalin himself changed his mind, or changed his opinion on this idea. And I want us to look at that now. And then next week, we'll continue on with this read, starting with part 3. How does that sound, chat? Presentation of the question will be next. So now we've set up what is a nation, and we've set up Stalin's view at this time of why fighting against national oppression is important, and the situating that struggle for national liberation in the question of the communist struggle. Nabil, welcome in. Good to see you. So, with that in mind, I want us to look at Stalin's final speech here. Good, I got it. Have a look at Stalin's final speech right here. And I want you to look at what he says here. Comrades, permit me to express appreciation. I'll let him talk first, and then I'll read it.
Всем братским партиям и группам, представители которых почтили наш съезд своим присутствием, и которые прислали съезду приветственные обращения, выразить благодарность за братские приветствия, за пожелания успеха, за доверие. Для нас особенно ценно это доверие, которое означает готовность поддержать нашу партию в ее борьбе за светлое будущее народа, в ее борьбе против войны, в ее борьбе за сохранение мира. Было бы ошибочно думать, что наша партия, ставшая могущественной силой, не нуждается больше в поддержке. Это неверно. Наша партия и наша страна всегда нуждались и будут нуждаться в доверии, в сочувствии и поддержке братских народов за рубежом. Особенность этой поддержки состоит в том, что всякая поддержка миролюбивых стремлений нашей партии со стороны любой братской партии означает вместе с тем поддержку своего собственного народа в его борьбе за сохранение мира. Когда английские рабочие в 1918-1919 году во время вооруженного нападения английской буржуазии на Советский Союз организовали борьбу против войны под лозунгом «Руки прочь от России», то это была поддержка. Поддержка, прежде всего, в борьбе своего народа за мир, а потом и поддержка Советского Союза. Когда товарищ Торрес или товарищ Тольятти заявляют, что их народы не будут воевать против советских народов, то это есть поддержка. Прежде всего, поддержка рабочих и крестьян Франции и Италии, борющихся за мир, а потом и поддержка миролюбивых стремлений Советского Союза. Эта особенность взаимной поддержки объясняется тем, что интересы нашей партии не только не противоречат, а наоборот, сливаются с интересом миролюбивых народов. Что же касается Советского Союза, то его интересы вообще неотделимы от дела мира во всем мире. Понятно, что наша партия не может оставаться в долгу у братских партий, и она сама должна, в свою очередь, оказывать им поддержку, а также их народам в их борьбе за освобождение, в их борьбе за сохранение мира. Как известно, она, наша партия, именно так и поступает. После взятия власти нашей партии в 1917 году и после того, как партия предприняла реальные меры по ликвидации капиталистического помещичьего гнета, представители братских партий, восхищаясь отвагой и успехами нашей партии, присвоили ей звание ударной бригады мирового революционного и рабочего движения. Этим они выражали надежду, что успехи ударной бригады облегчат положение народам, томящимся под гнетом капитализма. Я думаю, что наша партия оправдала эти надежды, особенно в период Второй мировой войны, когда Советский Союз, разгромив немецкую, японскую, фашистскую тиранию, избавил народы Европы и Азии от угроз фашистского рабства. Конечно, очень трудно было выполнять эту почетную роль, пока ударная бригада была одна единственная, и пока приходилось ей выполнять эту передовую роль почти в одиночестве. Но это было. Теперь совсем другое дело. Теперь, когда от Китая и Кореи до Чехословакии и Венгрии появились новые ударные бригады, в лице народно-демократических стран. Теперь нашей партии легче стало бороться. Да, и работа пошла веселее. Особого внимания заслуживают те коммунистические, демократические или рабоче-крестьянские партии, которые еще не пришли к власти и которые продолжают работать под пятой буржуазных драгоновских загонов. Им, конечно, труднее бороться. Однако им не столь трудно работать, как было трудно нам, русским коммунистам, в период царизма, когда малейшее движение вперед объявлялось тягчайшим преступлением. Однако русские коммунисты выстояли, не испугались трудностей и добились победы. То же самое будет с этими партиями. Почему все же не столь трудно будет работать этим партиям в сравнении с русскими коммунистами царского периода? Потому, во-первых, что они имеют перед глазами такие примеры борьбы и успехов, какие имеются в Советском Союзе и в народно-демократических странах. Следовательно, они
Don't worry, I will be reading this to you to reiterate.
и успехах этих стран. И
There's hoax right there.
Потому, во-вторых, что сама буржуазия, главный враг освободительного движения, стала другой,
Khrushchev is too, right behind his head.
серьезным образом, стала более реакционной, потеряла связи с народом и тем ослабила себя. Понятно, что это обстоятельство должно также облегчить работу революционных демократических партий. Раньше буржуазия позволяла себе либеральничать, отстаивала буржуазно-демократические свободы и тем создавала себе популярность в народе.
And the point of me showing you, by the way, this final speech of him that you will see is much like Marx. When new information and historical changes happened, so did Stalin's opinion and analysis on the situation.
А все прочие граждане считаются сырым человеческим материалом, пригодным лишь для эксплуатации. Растоптан принцип равенства людей и наций. Он заменен принципом полноправия эксплуататорского меньшинства и бесправием эксплуатируемого большинства граждан. Знамя буржуазно-демократических свобод выброшено за борт. Я думаю, что это знамя придется поднять вам, представителям коммунистических демократических партий, и понести его вперед, если хотите собрать вокруг себя большинство народа. Больше некому его поднять. Раньше буржуазия считалась главой нации. Она отстаивала права и независимость нации, ставя их превыше всего. Теперь не осталось и следа от национального принципа. Теперь буржуазия продает права и независимость наций за доллары. Знамя национальной независимости и национального суверенитета выброшено за борт. Нет сомнения, что это знамя придется поднять вам, представителей коммунистических и демократических партий, и понести его вперед. Если хотите быть патриотами своей страны, если хотите стать руководящей силой нации, его никому больше.
See? Again, an updated perspective on nationalism right there. One that mirrors what Kim Jong-il says in his book later, if you remember my reading of that.
Должны облегчить работу коммунистических и демократических партий, не пришедших еще к власти. Следовательно, есть все основания рассчитывать на успехи и победу братских партий в странах господства капитала. Да здравствуют наши братские партии. пусть живут и здравствуют руководители братской партии. Да здравствует мир между народами. Долой поджигателей войны.
Okay, now I'll read it to you for those of you who could not follow the subtitles. I wanted you to hear it in Stalin's voice first, okay? Comrades,
Разрешите
permit me to express appreciation
от имени
on behalf of our Congress
всем
to all fraternal parties and groups
представителей которых
whose representatives have honored the party conference with their presence,
или которые прислались
and those who have sent the Congress greetings of friendship.
выразить
We are grateful
за
for their fraternal greetings,
действия, за пожелания,
for their wishes of our success,
за доверие.
and for their trust.
Для нас
For us, their trust is particularly valuable
которые означают
because it indicates their readiness
поддержать
to support our party
в ее борьбе,
in our struggle for the bright future of humanity,
в ее борьбе против,
in our struggle against war,
в ее борьбе
and in our struggle for the preservation of peace.
было бы ошибочно,
It would be a mistake to think that our party,
ставшая
which has
могущественной,
become a powerful force,
не нуждается больше в поддержке.
does not require more support.
Это неверно.
That is not true.
Наша партия
Our party
и наша
and
страна
our country
всегда нуждались
always need and will continue to need
в доверии,
the trust,
в сочувствии
sympathy,
и
and
поддержке
support of the
братских
fraternal people abroad.
партий. Особенность этой
The special nature of this support
состоит в том,
consists of the fact that all support for the peaceful efforts of our party
что со стороны
from any fraternal party
означает вместе с
signifies the support for their own people
в ее борьбе за сохранение.
in the struggle to preserve peace.
Когда английские рабочие в
When English workers in 1918 1919,
во время вооруженного
during the armed attack of the English bourgeoisie against the Soviet Union,
организовали
organized a struggle against war under the slogan, "Hands off Russia,"
то это была поддержка.
that was a form of support.
Поддержка прежде всего в борьбе с
It was support for the struggle of their own people for peace, and therefore support for the Soviet Union.
когда товарищ Торрес
When Comrade Torres
и товарищ
or
Толет
Comrade Togliatti
заявляют,
declare
что их
that their people will not fight against the Soviet people,
советских народов. То это
that too
поддержка.
is support.
Прежде всего поддержка
Above all, it is support for the workers and peasants of France and Italy
за мир.
who are for peace.
Потом и поддержка.
It is also support for the peaceful strivings of the Soviet Union.
Это особенность
The special nature of this support is that it signifies that the interests of our party are only not the opposite. They coincide with the interests of all peace-loving people.
Что же касается Советского Союза, то
As regards the Soviet Union, its interests in general cannot be separated from the cause of peace throughout the world.
наша партия не может,
It is understood that our party cannot stop supporting fraternal parties.
она сама
and must itself continue offering them any help, as well as help for their people in the struggle for liberation, in their struggle for the preservation of peace. It is well known that this is precisely what our party does. After our party's seizure of power in 1917, and after our party took real measures to liquidate the yoke of capitalists and landowners, representatives of fraternal parties, in admiration of the bravery and success of our party, proclaimed it the shock brigade of the world revolution and the workers' movement. In doing so, they expressed the hope that this shock brigade would ease the suffering of the people still under capitalist yoke. I believe our party has fulfilled these hopes, especially during the period of the Second World War, when the Soviet Union smashed German and Japanese fascist tyranny and liberated the people of Europe and Asia from fascist slavery. Of course, it was very difficult to fulfill this honorable role at that time when the shock brigade was alone and one of a kind. At a time when it was called upon to fulfill its vanguard role almost single-handedly. But that was then. Now is a completely different matter. Now, from China and Korea, Czechoslovakia, a new shock brigades have appeared in the form of people's democracies. Now our party struggle are a bit easier, and our work is a bit more cheerful. Special attention needs to be paid to those communists, democratic and workers and peasants' parties that have not yet risen to power and continue to work under the heel of the draconian bourgeois rule. Their task is, of course, difficult. However, it is not as difficult for them to work as it was for us Russian communists in the period of Tsarism, when even the smallest step forward was considered a serious crime. But Russian communists stood firm, were not frightened by difficulties, and delivered victory. It will be the same with these parties. Why will the task not be so difficult for these parties in comparison to Russian communists during the Tsarist period? Because first of all, they have before them the examples of struggle and success in the Soviet Union and the people's democracies. It follows that they can learn from the mistakes and the successes of these countries. It thus makes their task easier. Secondly, the bourgeoisie, the principal enemy of the movement for freedom, is now different. It has changed in significant ways. It has become more reactionary. It has lost the support of its people and become weaker. It is understood that these circumstances should ease the labor of revolutionary and democratic parties. He's not wrong about that, despite it still being a long time. Previously, oh shit. This part right here comes the analysis with the upgrade of his own position on nationalism right here. It has become more reactionary. It has lost the support of the people and become weaker. It is understood that these circumstances should ease the labor of the revolutionary and democratic parties. Previously, the bourgeoisie portrayed themselves as liberal. They supported bourgeois democratic freedom, and in doing so, received popularity from the people. Now, there remains no trace of liberalism There is no longer any so-called freedom of the person. Personal rights are only recognized for those who possess capital. While all ordinary citizens are considered raw human resources, there is exploitation. The principle of equal rights for people as the nations has been ground to dust and replaced by the principle of full rights for the exploiting minority and an absence of rights for the exploited majority. The banner of bourgeois democratic freedom has been tossed overboard. I think this banner must be raised by you, representatives of communist and democratic parties, and carry forward if you want to gain the support of the majority of people. There is no one else to raise it. Right there. Previously, the bourgeoisie considered the nation to be supreme, and they supported the rights of independence of nations above all. Now, there is no trace left of this national principle. Now, the bourgeoisie sells national rights and independence for dollars. The banner of national independence and national sovereignty have been tossed overboard. There is no doubt this banner will be raised by you, representatives of communist and democratic parties, and carried forward. If you want to be patriots of your own country, if you want to be the leading powers of your nations, there is no one else to raise it. After stream today, go listen to my read of Kim Jong-il on having a correct understanding of nationalism. And you'll see a continuation now of this speech into a full analysis by Comrade Kim Jong-il. This is how matters stand at present. It is understood that all of these circumstances should make easier the work of communist and democratic parties that have not yet risen to power. Consequently, there is every reason to count on the success and victory of fraternal parties in countries under the rule of capital. Long live our fraternal parties. May the leaders of fraternal parties live and prosper. Long live peace between peoples. Down with the arsonists of war. There you go, Stalin's final speech. Just because I wanted to kind of give you, again, show you that the idea that the national struggle is always and at once a bourgeois struggle, even that opinion was, as you can see, changed from Stalin himself when examining new historical conditions. And so, like I say, take that and now, after stream, go and listen to my reading of Comrade Kim Jong-il on having a correct understanding of nationalism, and you'll see that carried forward even more in an important way.